So tonight we welcome Ric Mixter. Ric's been around for a while, worked for TV5, travels throughout Michigan, the Midwest, speaking at shipwreck festivals, dive conventions, libraries, museums, schools, pretty much anywhere where anybody would want to sit and listen to him talk about history. I made some notes, Ric. I was looking at your biography online, and you got a really long resume. So my wife was giving me comments about how long I spent on the internet, and I've met you a few times. I've seen you at the Shipwreck Festival down at Washtenaw College. I bought your books, got them signed, seen a lot of your presentations, but I really didn't know much more about you until I really started digging and looking at your biography and doing some research on my own, so I could intelligently stand up here and talk about you. So she said it was too long, people are going to get bored, but there's some great information, Ric, and I don't know how old some of this information is, but I'll give it a shot, and when you come up and talk, you can correct me on my flaws. So, let's get moving here. Ric's a journalist. He's a historian, author. I've seen pictures on your Facebook page. Were you a DJ a long time ago?
At age 16, yeah.
Okay. I've seen the pictures like from the 80s, look like, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
WIOG right here in town.
All right. Ric created, I'm going to say, over 30 documentaries. Okay, I think that information I have is a little old. Wrote 3 books. Is there a 4th coming?
There is.
Okay, we got a 4th book. You can talk about that. I won't spoil that. He's wrote several periodicals. Okay, his documentaries have been on PBS and the Outdoor Channel. He's had appearances on the History and Discovery channels as a shipwreck expert. He's got a lot of YouTube videos, so there's tons of information out there. A lot of good long YouTube videos, over a half hour, some are an hour long. He created the Storm Maritime Concert Series, and that was great. I've seen that down at the State Theater when you were in Bay City, and it was great. And you traveled to Port Huron, and I think a couple other locations after that. Yep. Ric was a scuba diver, and he can probably elaborate more on that, what got him into all this. I'm not going to spoil that because that's a good story. Ric's been on over 100 shipwrecks. That's great. I'm a fellow diver also, and I think I've only dove on a dozen shipwrecks, but so that's great. He's made expeditions to the Edmund Fitzgerald and the Carl Bradley, and the Edmund Fitzgerald is one of his big starts in the business, so he can expand on that later too. Are you still the president of the Great Lakes Lighthouse Association?
No, retired. I'm very old.
Okay. Great Lakes Lighthouse Keepers Association, former president. You still on the board of directors for the Association for Great Lakes Maritime Historians?
I termed out after 6 years. I'm very old.
Okay. So, if this dates, I'm going back to 2009, he received the award for historic interpretation from the Association for Great Lakes Maritime Historians. That's a great achievement. Something I didn't know about Ric, he's a private pilot, and he's logged, what I read, over 100 hours in military aircraft, filming, and they like to have a stick to.
Being in the way.
Yeah, being in the way. Now this is what I don't understand. He's a private pilot, but he's also a skydiver, and he's done many jumps at 12,000 feet. So you're jumping out of a good plane, and you're a pilot. So, pretty interesting. All right, so we'll get rolling. I don't want to bore anybody else. So, Without further ado, please welcome Ric Mixter.
Thank you. Thank you, brother. Thank you, thank you. Everybody always says skydiver, scuba diver, you go in submarines. What's the most dangerous thing you do? Grandpa. Grandpa is the most dangerous thing I do. Last night, Sheila and I got the tar beat out of us by ninja kids that, oh my God, I'm a punching bag and I've got the bruises to prove it, but the best job of all for sure. In fact, Sheila, why don't you come up and spend 15 minutes telling how great of a husband I am too? She's shaking her head no. Ah, man, you're never a rock star in your own family, are you? At all. I came out of Cracker Barrel today, and my wife's always like, nobody remembers who you are anymore. And I held the door for this couple. I said, welcome to Cracker Barrel. And she goes, you're Ric Mixter. See, Sheila, I know. Where did this story start? We found a shipwreck at Whitefish Point, and it was loaded full of a cargo I could not identify. And right away, I'm like, that's weird. It's filled right to the brim with something, and I couldn't tell what it was. And the measurement put it really close to being the Adela Shores, which I found out was salt. Usually, we would see salt being hauled in barrels on most of the shipwrecks, especially the early cargoes. But bulk transport was possible, too. So Adela did have bulk salt, and that's how this started. So this began an entire background into the salt industry, which was huge for this area. In fact, right now we're sitting right above 1,000 feet down below us is a 400-million-year-old ocean that they tapped for years to make salt. And now, as you might have seen, they actually are going to tap it again and get chemicals out of it as well. So did we know about these? We did. Did the Native Americans know about these? Yes, they did, because every deer in the woods runs out to these salt licks, and they'd be attracted to these areas where the salt springs would come up. They loved the mineral, and as hunters know, you can put a salt block out. This was the best place for Native Americans to hunt, was where these brine wells would come up. And in many cases, it was so strong, such a high salinity, that it would actually crust along the sides, especially in the case of Onondaga, which we'll talk about in a minute. Well, I'll bring up a map of it right now. Lake Onondaga was initially known as Ganataka by the Native Americans, the Onondaga tribe. And as the French priests started to come in, we get the relations, the words that they wrote out of their diaries that they would turn into the church, and that became books that were actually published in France. And it gave us many of our first insights to the New World especially, and of course the Great Lakes too. And this was really special because we get to see from Gabriel Lamont about the first time where he says there is an area where the Native Americans say the water is so bad you cannot drink it. So this was talking about the very southern location in Lake Onondaga where it actually was a milky white. In fact, when Father Charlevoix came into the area, he wrote in his relations a complete translation. Is there anybody here who speaks French that can read? Well, luckily I've got Google Translate, and I can tell you several salt springs, which are the borders, are covered with a very fine salt, further from a source whose water is as strong and white as milk. So here is now this very strong salt that's right on the coastline of the lake, and the Native Americans realize this has magical properties. They can actually prolong the use of their meat by making pemmican and jerkies out of it. This is also used for seasoning, for so many of the dishes, especially corn and squash. The Native Americans, it needed seasoning, and the salt was a very big commodity. For the New World, most of our salt was coming from England, and this was a very difficult thing to fight because the ships that would come over from England would come here. In the latter portion of the 1800s, it would trade the cotton crops, bring them back to Europe, and when they came back for ballast, they would use salt. So it didn't even cost them anything to bring it to the New World, to the United States at that time. And so it was very difficult to fight that price unless you could get a source that was closer to the places where you wanted to deliver it. And it was hard to argue with what was becoming Syracuse. In fact, here we see now the 1797 treaty with the Onondaga Nation. You see in the far right, that is Father Simon Lemoyne, and he literally has a pinch of salt in this relief picture. So he's got the pinch, and you see Garcante has a bowl that has been slowly boiled down until they had a crystal salt that they could trade and also use for their own uses, of course, right there. So you see right there a little bowl of the salt. And this whole city becomes known as Salt City, USA, because of the commodity of salt that would come out of here, which at the time, the highest ratings that I've seen bubbling up from the deepest part, we would see around 75% salinity. So 100% meaning it's fully saturated with salt. The ocean is, I think, they call it more of a saline solution. That would be more of like maybe a 7% or an 8%. So you're talking very, very strong salt that came out. And here's what they would do. They'd put the salt into these big, from the wells, it would come down into these pipes that they cut out of wood, and then it would go into the pans. And here this would start to work with the lumber industry, where they would have all these tailings, all these extra pieces that were cut from the 2x4s and the shingles that were made, and they had a ready source of fire, of fuel, to make sure that these would boil and eventually turn the crystal, and then they'd pull it off and bring it in to actually turn it into a commodity that could be moved around the through boats and such. And this we see here, Onondaga, which started in about 1794. The government took over after the first treaty with the First Nation there. They were allowed to collect it, and the government kind of took a role in this, realizing it would be a good commodity to have. And you see here they're already making $2,000 in 1812 or 1814. So they're bringing in a lot of money from the salt that's coming up here. They also found out that, yes, it's easy to boil it off, but they could just put it under the sun, and the sun could use its solar capabilities to allow it to, slowly evaporate and become a concentrated salt. The problem is it tends to rain around the Great Lakes. And so what you see here are all of these giant wooden shutters. And when it starts to rain or threaten rain in Syracuse, the entire town would come out. Now imagine this picture you're seeing here. This is also what Zilwaukee looked like in Carlton. This was most of Carlton, had these massive pans that were out of these solar evaporators, and they had all of this wood that the whole town would come out and cover so that the rain wouldn't dilute all the time that they had creating this salt. Here's a fun job. Here's your scoop right here. Scoop up the salt that is clearly laying everywhere. And then these are 5-pound bags of salt that they would actually, this would be a table salt that they could use. The quality was so good here too, it was very good for cheese making. So dairy salt, which they thought we could only use stuff from Europe, was coming out of Syracuse, which was pretty exciting. Here we see some of those solar salt sheds here, and down here on the very bottom, this is Syracuse down here, and then the town of Salina. Many people don't know that South Saginaw was actually called Salina at first too, and that was because of the salt industry that was there. What happened here though, that this blue line indicates a man-made trench that they created called the Erie Canal. So now we have a way to take all of the salt coming right into the city right here and shipping it on these canal boats, and you see the barrels on top full of salt, ready to go to markets like Boston, New York, where it caught on very quickly that this was a high quality salt, and it became a pretty strong commodity, especially as we went into the Civil War as well. The problem is they also found out that the wells in this area always had a constant temperature of 52 degrees. So they thought this is a great way for free air conditioning. So they started piping the saline that went all the way around, and that those wells opened up and slowly started to actually diffuse the ocean that they had underneath there. So they lost their industry by pumping literally everything out and having fresh water go in, and pretty much really Saginaw Bay City put the nail in their coffin as far as the commodity went, because literally they did it better here and had better quality as well. But it didn't help that they were diluting their product right there. Here, this is actually Port Huron, but it shows you how this fills right up with salt, and they barrel it. They'd have their own cooperage where they'd make the barrels and ship it out. Now, of course, in this early 1800s, 1900s, the railway system has not been developed. The way to get this to market was through schooners. And of course, whenever you have schooners on the Great Lakes, you're going to have shipwrecks on the Great Lakes. So 1818 is the first one I can find off of Cleveland. They call it a melancholy shipwreck, where the entire crew is lost, driven ashore near the Grand River, and bilged. And actually, this says Cleveland, but that must be the Cleveland newspaper, because they're talking about the Grand River in Ontario, which would be on the northern side of the lake. And you see several other vessels go under, and that's because of the storm that was there. This is a very rudimentary map that I made of all of the shipments that I've found that haven't made it, going through databases, searching cargoes. of ships that were carrying mostly salt is how I narrowed it down. The big triangles are the ones we'll talk about tonight. Some of the locations you can see are all around the Great Lakes. And we're talking, you know, obviously all of the Syracuse coming out of this area, going all the way down here. We saw a lot of movement coming out of Buffalo right here. So we see a lot, the yellow dots indicating we don't know where the shipwrecks are, but certainly in the case of the Zephyr, the Franklin, these are all vessels that ran aground with cargo, in many cases 300 barrels of salt that were down. Tragically on the Zephyr, there's 10 people that lost their lives, 4 more on the Franklin, all in a storm in 1820. The Good Intent, Captain Abraham Talbot, coming out of Buffalo, waited for several days till the conditions were right. And unfortunately, they turned on him again and sank him. And this is a guy who literally had just saved the crew of the Superior. So here he's a hero on the lakes and then loses his own life to the same treacherous lakes that built up in 1825, a May storm that had brought this ship down. And very sadly, 7 people losing their lives on the Good Intent. 1843, the South America has 600 barrels, 8 crew members that go down. Here's a nice picture of the South America on Lake Erie as it was lost. And again, tragedy, and as they go into the details of the family members that wouldn't have loved ones coming home after that big storm. Of course, many of these are tied to very long stories too. These are my favorites. Usually you get one little hint that says, ship is gone, family is sad, and that's about it. This actually is a story that is incredibly detailed, and it starts up in Munising. So the Philip Sheridan, do you guys know who Phil Sheridan is from the Civil War? Very famous, involved especially at Appomattox for the Union side, and wanted to run for president but wasn't from the US, and of course our Constitution wouldn't allow him to be president, but was big enough that they named a steamboat for him. So Phil Sheridan's boat gets stuck up on Grand Island, and the workers are all basically stranded. If you've been to Grand Island, you know it's out in the middle of nowhere. And they basically told them, well, if you want to go home, you better help us get this boat off of here. So they offloaded a lot of the cargo for the ship to be lightened up and brought off the rocks there. And it turns out they were paying the Native Americans there twice as much, and all the crew were getting upset. And they weren't just screaming at the captain here. They were mad at Eber Ward, who owned the ship. He's a huge ship owner. And a lot of the crew were pretty upset about this. And they came down to Detroit. The boat was going to get patched up. They were complaining that it was in bad shape. They got into the river system, and many of them said that they wanted to leave. And the captain said, you just wait till we get to shore, and I'll make sure that you get off. And he just kept going. And what are they going to do, swim, you know, to Ontario? So the headlines start coming out that not only is Eber Ward cheap, but also they tried to kidnap all of the crew. And it gets even worse because, as you see here in 1875, it caught fire and burned right to the waterline. So all the crew jump off, the captain leaving last, getting on board a tugboat, the steamer Turner picking up the last 2, and we see most of the crew getting safely to shore and right away going to Detroit to get drunk. And so they head into Detroit. One guy starts shooting off his mouth. He sees another sailor that's another deckhand that he knows that's getting picked on by a guy, and he kind of rescues him, and they leave. Well, then they meet up with the big bully guy again, and of course it turns ugly because he says he's defending Eber Ward's honor by not allowing these men to talk bad about him. Most people believe it was because he had pulled him off this other guy to keep him from fighting, but it turns out that this big fight broke out. Peter Wheelahand on board the Phil Sheridan tells this guy, leave him alone. Plug Campbell punches him one time in the throat and kills him on the spot. Drops him right there, right where Cobo Hall is today. Used to be the Rob Roy Hotel, and this is the area where this all went down. And right away, Campbell, his nickname's Plug, he takes off and peeks in to see what's going on, realizes that this guy's in bad way. So he hops on board a couple of different trains, and they finally find him halfway to Buffalo, and they bring him back for trial. And there's a whole autopsy and everything. How did he do it with one punch? And it turns out that he had gotten a blood clot from hitting him. And all this story comes down to, who's right, who's wrong. Well, it turns out that one of the Detroit news guys was doing a story on Eber Ward being cheap and was following. So he saw the whole thing. So it's the most detailed case I've ever seen, because if you're going to murder somebody, don't do it in front of a reporter. It's just not your best gig. But this is what happened for Plug Campbell. And right away they said, well, He pleads guilty and says, I'll go. And they said, we have a brand new prison that you're going to enjoy. Jackson had just opened up, and they put him in there for 10 years. And he was a model prisoner by all accounts, because Governor Charles Croswell actually let him out after 10 years, said, you've served your time. The one thing that you have to do, though, is leave Michigan and never come back. And if you make that promise, you can take off. And I swear to you, I've searched now for 5 months. I can't find Plug Campbell anywhere. So he went deep underground, and I can't even find an obituary on the guy. So I'm not sure where he ended up going, but we probably know it wasn't in Michigan. 1880 is when he got out. So deep beneath us is this ocean, and as you see, Syracuse is really right on the northern shore of this deep ocean that here is about 1,000 feet under the surface. It comes very close to the surface here, and especially in Goderich, where they actually mine it today. And then in the northern areas, this is more like 3,000 feet down. It goes that this ocean was a very shallow ocean 400 million years ago. So you're talking about the Devonian time. And this is after we had a massive line of mountains that were actually taller than Mount Everest in this area that now became the Appalachian Mountains here. And as they eroded down, they filled in this ocean. And you're like saying, Rick, it's freezing outside. How could we have an ocean here? How could we have warm water creatures that lived, you know, especially little shell creatures? Well, it turns out that Michigan is nowhere near where it was 400 million years ago because of tectonic plate shifting and the world kind of moving around. This is more of what the Earth looked like 400 million years ago. Here's your equator. Here's where we're way up here. And here's Michigan in this shallow ocean below the equator. So during the Devonian period, these start to shift and break off and become North and South America, and then Europe forms over here. And you actually have Michigan way, way up here, and all of that erosion, and of course the giant mile-thick glaciers that carved their way through moved a lot of that sediment around too to bring that ocean a little bit closer to the surface, enough for the springs to start to pop up to where those animals would start to find them and our Native American friends would find them. So when Michigan became a state, they said, this sounds like a pretty good resource. We know New York's been doing great with salt since 1700. So they said, why don't we send our first geologist, Doug Houghton, to leave from Detroit, and he'll go up and check out our copper resources in the UP, our iron ore resources, and that salt that we've heard about, especially on the Salt River, which is a dead giveaway that it probably has salt if it's called the Salt River. This is actually very close where it meets the Tittabawassee, is very close to where that dam broke loose not too long ago when we saw Sanford just devastated by the water that was there. So he gets on a coach at Royal Oak, goes to Byron, and then hops in a canoe and starts going all the way up the Shiawassee River and has very detailed information. If you want to go online, search Doug Houghton diary, and you will find his entire diary that's there. And it includes all of the tragic part of going past Midland that's now an empty village that used to be a Native American village that was killed off by smallpox. Now he's a medical doctor, and he actually later comes in as they build a vaccine using the scabs from the smallpox. He starts to vaccinate many of the northern tribes. So he does something about it, but here he's just reporting that all these towns are just devastated where the population is almost completely gone. So I thought this would be a cool place for me to go and do some exploring because, you know, I'm a world-class explorer and I've got all the dollars in the world. So I packed up my gear and I thought it's time for us to go take a look. So this is beginning on the Tittabawassee River. I'm just, Sanford would be right behind me, and the bridge system that goes across where the train crosses is actually very close to where the Salt River comes in, and I'll film in both spots. Houghton actually started in Royal Oak and took a carriage ride until he got to Byron, Michigan, where he got a canoe and started to ascend the Shiawassee River all the way through 3 different counties to go into Saginaw County. And of course it was on September 25th that an equinoctial storm, as he described it, hit the area. 6 days of pouring rain, and he wanted to try to measure a salt spring in that flooding. When Houghton traveled up to the Salt River, He just came just short of where we're at right now. And after 6 days of rain, his plan was to build an earthen dam around the spring, which appeared to be bluish in color, according to his notes. He would build up an earthen dam around them so he could take measurements of what the salinity was coming up from these deep underground wells. And to his surprise, the percentage was even better than that was found in Syracuse. See, it literally is at 90% salinity. That's 10% better than Syracuse. So now the quality is up. It's going to take less effort. And now you have in Saginaw Bay City the world's largest sawmill operation. So they have more wood than they think they'll ever need. And quite honestly, this existed so strongly until that wood was all cut down. So we started to see, first of all, the sawmills go up. This is an aerial view of Saginaw, but we didn't see any salt. And we're like, why didn't people get excited? Well, they immediately said that Houghton had discovered another salt spring near the Grand River. That's how I knew the trivia question, by the way. So the Grand River had salt, and he said, one of the state representatives is like, yeah, well, we should probably get some money from the state to start harvesting this salt. And everybody in Saginaw cried foul, like, oh, no, you don't. So the only way to keep this fair is if you do a bounty on the first salt that's produced. So whoever gets to market first gets to collect 10 cents per bushel. So you're talking 280 pounds, they get 10 cents. And right away, a company formed right here near where Gray Iron is today. This is the East Saginaw Salt Company, formed up from a bunch of the local bigwigs, and they started making salt and immediately demanded from the state $5,000, and the treasurer freaked out. Like, we can't afford to pay this. So almost immediately, Governor Blair said, we're going to abolish that bounty. It's no longer worth it because these guys, we're going to be paying for their production when they're making, you know, tens of thousands of dollars coming out of this. And you see the different mills that are here. You can see some of the salt blocks that are there, and you see that the depths that they're reaching, 210, they're actually getting 10 degrees of salinity, and all the way down to 600 feet that they're actually getting top quality stuff. And now we're seeing all of these sawmills start to make their own salt. And this is East Salt, this is that entire area. So right up here would be where Gray Iron Foundry is now, and this whole area is all now filled in, which we built several ships over here. In fact, the shipyard that was here was actually, Hoyt had built 5 different schooners, so the timing was perfect. He had the Quick Step, the Starlight, the Winslow, the Jesse Hoyt, all built to haul salt and lumber. So he had his own fleet ready to go and had a ready, made market with essentially free heat to heat up those salt deposits to boil them down. So this is where this all grew up. These wells here and over in here are still there. The DNR still monitors those wells. Those are the first ones we saw. This is over by Potoff Park. As you go on Washington Avenue in Saginaw, you can see the block, and you can actually see the mill and the salt block right here. And this is probably the most unsafe place to ever fish. I can't even believe they're on there, but look at these boom. This is the boom area where they would bring the lumber in that had just been cut during the spring freshets, and then it would be cut up in the mill and then taken to market. And of course, Saginaw was one of the world leaders in that. Here we see the Wright works, and you can tell on the other side is almost what is now Ojibwe Island over there. And lots of planing and shingles that were coming out of here as well. This is Ariel Bay City, first salt coming out of this area, which eventually became your pipe manufacturing company. We also see, very cool, this is the bridge that I actually crossed coming over here. This is the ball diamonds now, and of course Davidson Shipyard Slip would be in this area. Henry Sage having the huge operation that's right now where the bridge is. This later becoming one of the big shipbuilding. We see Wheeler's dad actually building here, and then Frank Wheeler building a little bit further down, which became massive industries for this area too. Love this little picture of the Saginaw. You can zoom in and actually see they've got Saginaw on it. Look at Middle Grounds. They actually cut a channel, Sage cut a channel right through so his ships could get faster back and forth to his mills, which of course now is filled in. And Eddy, which very famous. We even have a shipwreck that's named for one of the Eddy brothers, the Newell Eddy, that's up in the Straits of Mackinac. Great map here showing you many of the salt blocks that came in. And we see the McGraw Mill, which is one of the larger ones, first bringing salt up and eventually going into brine. And solutions like Dow went into the bromine industry because of the salt that was available here as well. This really surprised me. Found this on eBay. I was just looking at Potter, you know, Potter Street Station, Potter being one of the general managers of the Pear Marquette line that came in. He signed this, so he left the East Saginaw Salt Company, formed his own at the Oneida Channel, which this is Crow Island. So when you cross the Z Bridge right here, the island is now filled in. This channel is now filled in. This was once a complete island that was here that had sawmills on it and a very large Oneida salt and lumber right here. This is the company that came in, and look at the bigwigs, Butterfield and the Fargo brothers from Wells Fargo. So you're talking about nationwide leaders that are coming to Saginaw now to invest their money to put in, especially these guys right here is where they built, in an area that is now Wirt Stone Docks would be on this side right about here. So there's still industry there, but no longer the channel, which was all filled in when they first put in the highway, and then of course when 75 came in. Melrose had 3,000 barrels of Bay City salt when it went down near Sheboygan. Melrose is right here. This is a wreck on South Fox Island. When I was up there looking at the lighthouse, I said, you should go see our shipwreck. And I said, which one is it? They said, we're not sure, we think it's the Platte, and I think it is. The James Platte was carrying Bay City salt going down to Chicago, crashed ashore, and unfortunately Henry Turner, the captain, drowned, and so did the cook. Turner's grave is right next to the lighthouse up there. At least we believe it is, because it's just got an emblem, one of the Republic Guard emblems that's on there, and so there's nothing that says specifically, but we think it's probably him. Another incredible story, here's the sole survivor of the Waukesha. And Frank said this is, he's been on 12 shipwrecks, which I don't know why you'd ever sail with somebody that's been on 12 shipwrecks as a rule. But he got on board this one, and he said as soon as the Waukesha left Ludington, the captain and the first mate started drinking whiskey. And they got so drunk that they couldn't even handle the storm, and that's why they crashed ashore near Muskegon. And here you see him wearing his life vest and his the one life ring. Right out in front of the big rocks in Muskegon. And everybody said, Frank Duloc, you are new to this, you're lying about our captains. These guys would never do that, until the next day when a whiskey jug washed ashore. And a lot of people went, well, maybe Frank wasn't wrong about that. So, but tragically, he's the last survivor on a salt ship that came in. Margaret Muir, right here, is another one that was lost in 1893 with 4,200 barrels of Bay City salt, headed for Algoma, and sadly did not make it. This is the Miztec, and I hope you guys have seen these. If you haven't, 3dshipwreck.org, or just search 3D Shipwreck and Great Lakes, and you'll find this site. Ken Merriman's been working with a photographer named Andrew Goodman. And these guys go out and they film thousands of pictures of a shipwreck, and then they use software to tie it together so that you can do this. You can rotate it in 3D, and so even these wrecks that are broken up, you can find areas like the knees that are on the side where the deck was actually on. This is filleted open. And you can go around and see the top of the pilot house. You can go right down to the back end where the boilers are. And these are so detailed that you can see the rivets in the boilers. So if there's names on there, you can zoom in. It's amazing. And this wreck, the Miztec, is interesting, but it's so broken up, and especially in Lake Superior, you're only seeing bits and pieces of the area. It makes so much more sense when it's completely put together there. So lost with salt, and unfortunately its entire crew. Mingo was a little bit better. This was off the Apostle Islands in 1928. Bay City Company, Blodgett owning many of the boats that were here, and he had a string of very bad luck since really the late 1800s into the 1920s, where he lost at least a dozen ships to big storms, and Mingo being one of them. The crew got off, but the salt that was on board was all lost, and we haven't found the Mingo yet, which would be a very interesting shipwreck, but it could be in very deep water out there. So the Eddy brothers, I showed you their mill in Bay City. They had a cousin named Jack who actually said, I'm going to go into business. He went to one of the Ivy League schools, met Ned Skinner, and said, I think this is a good idea, but I don't think we should be tied to the boards and the wood. We need to use coal, and that's how I'm going to fire my boiling system. And he was smart, because Saginaw Bay City were going out of business because their ready source, they tried for a while to get wood from Georgia, or from Georgian Bay. So they're going to Canada, which at first was good until the Canadians figured out how much money was being pushed in rafts that were a mile long with 3 million logs. You know, these big, huge Bautel bringing those huge barges of wood. And they quickly put tariffs on the wood, and that pretty much shut off our Canadian market for getting wood here. And that's when all of our yards started to close down. But these guys went to Ludington, and they actually started building right down here on Pere Marquette Lake. And this is part of the plant they built for Anchor Salt, which would later be bought up by Morton, as a matter of fact. And there's been a couple of different ships that have been lost carrying this salt, including a big storm in 1909. This was an incredible storm that hit the Apostle Islands, the Huron Islands. We lost a big barge, the Nestor, over in the Huron Islands. With all hands. Sadly, the lighthouse keeper was up on top trying to help. He was 40 feet above the shipwreck, and a piece of the shipwreck flew up and broke his shoulder from down below, and he couldn't render any help. There was even a revenue cutter on the other side of the island hiding from the storm, but they had no radios, obviously, so they couldn't know that there was a accident that was happening. So the Nestor went down with all hands, and there was not much they could do. The Urania crew was a little easier. There was a bunch of ice that was being blown by this storm into Whitefish Bay, and their ship got squeezed in this ice flow, and it crushed it. So the guys got into a lifeboat and started pushing on the ice until they reached open water, hopped back into the boat, sailed for a little bit on their boat, rowed for a little bit, and then jumped back on the ice, went for 3 miles until they found safety on another ship. And the Urania folded up and sank on Parisian Island, and they found it in the 70s, but I don't know of any footage of that. In fact, I talked to Tom Farnquist 2 weekends ago in Detroit when we saw him at the show, and he said that they only filmed a couple of minutes when they used the ROV that filmed the Fitzgerald, and they saw the Urania that they had discovered on sonar. So Urania's down, the Nestor's down. Of course, the Russia is the other story, where here they are by the Detour Light. They can see the lighthouse, the ship gets into the storm, it starts to sink, they all get in the lifeboat, they steer themselves to Detour for safety. Everybody survives, and the Russia was just discovered just a couple of years ago, and it's in remarkable shape for going through a storm. So that's 1909, but after all of these big headlines, people start to say about a week later, what about the Adela Shores? It hasn't shown up, it's been 9 days, what happens? And of course the lifesavers all along the coast, the shipwreck coast we call, from Grand Marais to Whitefish, start finding wreckage. And unfortunately, it's all tied into this storm that comes in. So this is April 30th, 1909. Look at how quickly it jumps from here, and then 8 hours, this front jumps all the way up to Whitefish Point, and this is where the Adela Shores was. So these massive waves are starting to build up. It's too much for everybody on the crew. They all go down, all hands are lost, and not a lot of details come out. There's a little bit of talk about a raft. I don't see anything of a body being recovered from this wreck at all. And it's largely forgotten, really. All hope is lost with the Adela Shores. The story of the Shores and Shores Lumber is another complete lecture of a mill that was torn apart in Muskegon, shipped all the way up to Ashland, Wisconsin, and reassembled. Shores made a lot of money with his fleet. Also sued the Adela Shores when she was first built because she started leaking so bad they had to jettison 7 million board feet, or no, it's a 4 million board feet of lumber that went into the water, and they had to settle it out in court because they said the ship wasn't built correctly. Here's Shores Lumber Dock in Ashland. In fact, this is a picture of Adela, his beautiful daughter. And the whole operation, this is the largest dock system I've seen in Ashland, which of course now everything's pretty much gone, but this was the last real respite of trees that were left coming out of Wisconsin. I did find this though. My wife, when I go to Chicago, in fact it's coming up here in the next couple of weeks, she has a conference there as she works in the pharmaceutical industry with travel, and she always says, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to go to National Archives, and I'm going to be their best friend because I'm going to go through every logbook that they have there. And I did. I went through all of the logbooks for Crisp Point and Whitefish Point, and I'm trying to find things that haven't been published. And sure enough, in this logbook, we find there are a note that's found on a piece of board that says there are 9 of us on life raft. We are abreast of, and then with a big cliffhanger, it's not written where they're at. The writing stops. And the signboard of the Adela Shores is right next to them. So here these people did make it to a life raft. We now know this. It was never made it to a newspaper story that I can find, which blows my mind. The newspapers would eat this up. And clearly it absolutely wasn't. But James McGraw writing all of the stories, and again telling the stories of the just a little tiny debris that's kind of being washed ashore. Here's one too that they found a piece of the side of a ship with an oar that was clearly attached and a coat hanging on it, and in the pocket was Peter Olson of West Allis, Wisconsin's sailing card. So they knew whose it was, but this was picked up by a tugboat off of the coast of Grand Island and brought to Marquette. So there's no official account of this from any of the lifesavers that I can find. I haven't checked Marquette, I should, but my guess is they went straight to the newspaper and didn't go to the lifesavers at Marquette. But interesting that this would have been another story that came out of Peter Olson. So interesting that we go up and we start searching. During COVID, I had plenty of time to write 2 new books, and anytime they needed somebody to pull cable on the Boyd, our research vessel, they'd call me up because I have a relatively strong back, even though that back turned 60, Tuesday. It definitely feels the pain of pulling it up. But we get up there and they hit a couple of targets and they said, Rick, we'd love for you to come along and help us out. One of them turned into the story that you might have seen on National Geographic. If you want, Google National Geographic Ghosts of the Great Lakes and you'll find a story with Rick's goofy mug on there talking about the lumber vessels that we discovered on there. A real honor though for me to be on Nat Geo, which to me is the very top of all of the channels that do history like this. So we lower the robot down, it's probably a $580,000 robot, and down it goes to 640 feet, and we start searching. Now we're hoping that we'll find, like when we found the Bay City built Atlanta, we found a name board that was written in gold letters, Atlanta, and you instantly know what ship you found. But on this one, we had a little more difficulty as we go along. This is Daryl Ertel, he's our Director of Operations. One of the coolest, he never gets excited. He finds these pieces of history and goes, oh, look, a shipwreck. Like, dude, don't you ever get excited? But it was funny because the people at the National Geographic were like, I think we can work with this. They didn't know what to do with him because he would never get excited. Now, luckily, Rick's a little more excitable, so they got a lot of stuff from me. Here we go on the backside. We can tell it's a wooden ship. We can now tell it is a steamer. The propeller coming into view is clearly a square propeller. It's a little bit different than what we normally see in our more modern ships. So we're starting to put it into a date that starts to push us into the late 1800s. No name board painted on it. Now that fits for the Adela Shores because when she was launched, she wasn't named Adela Shores. So the name board was never really painted as a board on it. It was painted right on the hull itself. So it kind of fits, but look at that old steam. They're looking at the propeller and the rudder, all looking for clues as well to see, what might have happened when the ship went down. This monitor is showing us the sonar forward to give us a good outline of what might be in our way. In the case of the lumber boats, they had 2x4s sticking out like porcupine quills. So he's got a big cable that feeds the power all the way down to 600 feet. And if that gets tangled, we lose a $500,000 robot. So we have to be really careful, and they never let Rick drive, which is probably the safest thing that they can do. Here's another salt-carrying vessel carrying Ludington salt. This is the Herman Hetler, and this was originally launched here in Bay City as the Walter Vail. This picture is drawn by the master of disaster. Ed Pusick was an incredible artist that was on the west coast of Michigan. I struck up a friendship with him just before he passed, and I was lucky enough to get a letter from him where he hand drew a little picture of a sailor, and his hand was out and he was looking for rescue. And so I have my own original from this amazing guy that can draw waves like nobody else. If you like Fred Stonehouse's books like I do, you realize that Ed's pictures are on almost every one of Fred Stonehouse's books, and well worth it. So here it is breaking up on the rocks. This is at Grand Island, loaded with salt. There's not a lot of details except that everybody made it and the salt was completely destroyed, and that some of the Uper camps actually have some of the wood that was built into here. But we also know that there's a lot of the wood that's still on the reef there. And we know this because how many people have taken the glass bottom boat tour in Munising? couple hands I see. If you ever get a chance to go, they're the best ones that we have. The sweepstakes at Georgian Bay in Tobermory has an amazing cruise, which I took on board our cruise ship last summer. We're going again. I'm going to be doing 2 weeks on a cruise ship starting in September. So Tobermory is a great glass bottom tour. Munising takes you over the Bermuda, takes you over the wreckage of the Hetler. You can also go to Sheboygan, and there's a fantastic glass bottom tour there as well. Captain Jen is really fun to be around as well. I saw on Facebook she's already jumped into Lake Huron, which she's also completely insane if she's already gone swimming. So here's a 3D trip that we'll take with compliments of Andrew and Ken as we zoom around, and you'll notice as we go forward here, let's see, spin it around, and we'll go to the back section where the engineering is, and we'll see that it's again filleted open. You can see some of the sides actually look like there's portholes on the side. The portholes are long gone. But if you look at the front, that kind of looks like a boat, as a matter of fact. And as you go to the very front, you're like, well, wait a minute. Here's a cool artifact. There's an anchor that's on here. Now, when I first started diving the Hetler, that anchor wasn't there. So it appears in the early this would be 96 or 97, and it was bright blue when it returned to the shipwreck. What happened was, we're going to go through the machinery too as well. What happened was there was an amnesty period for people to return stolen shipwrecks, and somebody brought that anchor up and painted it blue for their yard, and then realized they're going to get busted for having something that didn't belong to them. So they brought it back and they sank it when it's blue. So for the first 5 years, if you went in the cruise, you saw a bright blue anchor on the bottom of Lake Superior. Here we can even go by the high pressure cylinder of the engine too, which I have not seen this part of the wreckage. Again, this shows that it's a little bit further off the main wreck, and it'd be a great area to go. You just have to be careful because those boats have schedules. It's a very good business. They just built a brand new boat. Pete Lindquist is a super Youper too. He speaks fluent Youper, which is fun to listen to him if you go. He knows his pasties, eh? Here's that anchor as you look through the bottom of the boat. And this is how clear Lake Superior is. There's sometimes that it gets stirred up a little bit, but this is a beautiful place to go scuba diving because the wrecks are relatively shallow. Smith Moore is the only one that's relatively deep, about 90 feet. And the rest are all pretty shallow, and it's mostly protected by Grand Island, so that you could drive all the way to UP and not get blown off of the wreck by the winds, which is pretty incredible as well. Ludington grew quite large, and it was largely because of this company that Dow started to build. After Anchor Salt went out, Dow came in. The government actually came in when they realized this brine that was coming up also had magnesium on it. And during World War II, the government took control of this because we need magnesium for aluminum production and for other aircraft. It makes very light pieces, and that's why Dow came up with their Dow metal, the Dow magnesium that was used in piston rings and other things as well. The trace amounts, think about that, come up in brine that become big enough to make it into ingots and to be able to do things with is pretty incredible. Dow has still got a plant there. They just sold it off, and it's gone through 2 different ownerships, but they still make their main product here. And this is snow melt. This is the stuff that you'd use for whenever the snow comes out, and thank goodness we didn't have to use much of this year. But they still make it. They still call it Pella Dow. That's coming out of that plant, but they're not harvesting it from Ludington. It's piped down from Manistee, which had an even larger operation for salt coming out of there. Inside the brand new freighter, Mark Barker, this is footage of them moving salt. So they have a special coating on the inside, special paint that they can carry this very caustic equipment. You know, the salt is pretty damaging, and they push it into the bottom of the ship and break it free, and then it gets, the self-unloader actually unloads it. The Barker being a little bit smaller, so it can go into the river systems and actually deliver this to many different companies, as a matter of fact. I just found out too, and Sheila and I went for a little drive when we were talking to our grandson Finn. We went over here to see if any development was happening. Here's the Edson, and here's where the Jupiter actually caught fire, and the Independence Bridge right here, and this is going to be Wilkinson. Does anybody know if they've actually broke ground? Brian, have you heard anything at the station? No. They're going to be piping again down deep for this water, this brine solution, to make products out of it. And that's pretty incredible that we're now coming back to an industry that we thought, you know, had been gone so many years ago. But now, obviously, clearly there's a lot more they can do with it as well. Something I just finished up, and we'll wrap up with this. I have gone through all of TV5's footage all of WSGW's footage to search for almost 7 months of writing and logging everything that was on the air and what also wasn't on the air. And there's so much stuff that was there, including the captain of the Jupiter giving his testimony at City Hall. So many different things that were there, and I've turned it into an hour-long podcast. So you can learn everything, and it's got the broadcast, which for me was even more exciting to hear Jay Brando, who we've lost, and Mike Avery's reports. Fantastic news coverage. To see Dave Maurer and to go through that, he's actually got the reel-to-reel just before he retired from the radio station, of all the coverage from there. It was just an honor to be able to put this together and to really relive one of the biggest stories, and a story, quite honestly, that changed my life. At TV5, I might have been the crazy guy that flew airplanes and did, all of the feature stories for the Take 5 show. But really, it was the Jupiter explosion that got me into ship and learning more about the ships. We'd always have to get a weather shot. Brian remembers. I don't. Also, who else is here? Jeff is here too. We'd have to get weather shots that they would put up, and then you'd have Chuck Waters or whoever the weather guy is would go and put the screen on, and mine would almost always be ships. So I've got this great library of ships that have long been cut up, like the E.M. Ford and stuff, that I would save and keep. So it was great to relive a lot of that stuff and to realize that this was one of the bigger stories too. As TV5 celebrates 70 years now, it's easily in their top probably 5 stories, I think, of what's happened there, and just to be a part of that and to remember it. You can listen to it for free at shipwreckpodcast.com. There's over 15 hours now of all the interviews I've done with shipwreck survivors and stuff that are on there. The only thing that costs money is the Fitzgerald. It's 4 hours long, and it's everything I've ever learned. So it's $20 for 4 hours, and you'll need a nice car ride to be able to listen to all that. Are there any questions? I know I've kept you a little bit longer today. I wanted to make sure we talked all about the salt. Is there anything you want to know? Is there any questions you might have for me on shipwrecks? Yeah.
How many years is the Niagara up and down the Saginaw River?
How many times the what?
No, how many years was the Niagara? That was kind of like a frustrating ship.
Oh, yeah.
400 round trips a year.
Yeah, one of the sandsuckers, right? Yeah. The Niagara. Eventually it was scrapped. They brought it up to Tobermory and sank it.
How many years? Any idea how many years it was?
Was that 25 years or so? I think it might have been more too, yeah.
The 3rd Street Bridge, is that the one maybe bumped it?
Up, yeah, Don's?
Actually, the Niagara was the founding of this organization. There was a group that wanted to bring it back here to Bay City.
Wow.
And they, at the last minute, they didn't want it. So there's 3 of us that said, well, let's do a ship program and see what happens. Well, we had about 40 people at it. The next month we did the same thing. So we decided, well, let's form a maritime group, and the Niagara was the building block for us.
That's incredible. Wow, I didn't realize Niagara was built on the river too, wasn't it?
She was built at Wheeler, and it had a composite bottom on it.
Wow.
Because it was made for pulp, carrying pulp logs.
Yep.
Into Canada, and they put the bottom on it like that, so that when it would have to get on the rocks, it wouldn't hurt it.
That's incredible. Cool, lots of great history, and this is a fantastic group to be able to share that history. This is a very, very specialized industry, not only from the need for building the ships, which goes right back to the earliest of the 1800s. 600 hulls that were built on this river. It's incredible, and that's why I'm so glad to be here to represent this group. Yes, sir.
Have you ever met this guy Ballard in person?
Bob Ballard?
Yeah.
I have not. He just seemed like a boring geologist, and I thought, nah, I don't need to meet him. I am totally envious of him, and part of it is because he's done it all literally using the U.S. government. So all of the discoveries, especially Titanic, that was a cover story for him to find submarines and investigate those. I'm very jealous of that. I am thrilled to know that he was actually on board a ship that was built here in Bay City. So when he found Titanic, the Nor, the Nor was built here. So the legacy of the ships that were built here, it's very expansive, and quite honestly, there's a lot on the bottom. Not because they didn't build them well here. They built them fine here. They just built so many of them that almost a quarter of the shipwrecks off Whitefish Point actually came from the Saginaw River.
How about this guy Mel Fisher?
Mel Fisher, another incredible wreck hunter, a guy that gave the ultimate in the sadness that his son actually passed away collecting that treasure. The big fight that they had with Florida to collect all that treasure, of what, $1 billion in gold and silver and rubies and everything that was down there. So very interesting story. I am sad that people think there's treasure on the Great Lakes, and we see a lot of our shipwrecks destroyed by people who go down and think they should tear up the safe because the safe has to have money in it. So we see damage to shipwrecks like the Dean Richmond and the Regina, so many of the ones I can think of that were recently discovered where the cargoes really weren't worth anything. The Regina had on board whiskey bottles, scotch bottles that might have had some value because it's just aged whiskey, right? But most of it was tar and barbed wire and silverware and stuff like that, like a general store. But they tore the wreck apart trying to get to the safe. And of course, when they bring those up, they never find anything inside them. I have yet to see anybody that's ever had treasure. Yep.
Yeah, Rick, in your travels, would you have an idea how many shipwrecks are still out there that haven't been found?
There's all kinds of arguments where we've looked at databases by incredible people like Dave Swayze, who came together with a very comprehensive list of over 3,000 shipwrecks that have been on the Great Lakes. But it really comes down to, you know, how many of them were recovered. The most dangerous place on the Great Lakes, statistically in my eye, is the tip of the thumb, Point Out Barks, is where a lot of ships went down, but you're not going to find a ton of shipwrecks there because it would be ridiculous to leave it there. So people became very adept in Bay City with Reed and several other companies where they would raise these ships up. Even if 100 feet down, they would put pontoons on these and they would fill them full of air and lift these ships back up. So we see extensive repairs of ships like the Plymouth, where Reed brought it up from Marquette, brought it all the way to Bay City and put brand new planking on it and got another 40 years out of the ship. So a lot of these vessels that were lost on the thumb were shipwrecked, but we wouldn't call them a shipwreck because they're no longer there. So I would roughly guess that there's at least 500 valuable targets that would be interesting to find. And last year they found some of the ones that I was really thrilled about. The George Steinbrenner went down in '53 off of Isle Royal. And we thought that the water would be too deep to even bother looking. That's why most of the wreck hunters from 1950, when scuba came in heavy, to the 1980s, we saw most of the discoveries under 200 feet, because why would you try to find a wreck that you couldn't dive? Well, now technology is allowing us to do 300, 400 feet. Some divers dove the Fitzgerald at 500 feet, not for very long, and it's kind of silly to go down for 4 minutes and wait, 4 hours on the line just to say you did it, but they did it. So the technology is there now for us to go deeper. That's why Whitefish Point is going out. We're searching 100 miles a day. We can do 1 mile in a stretch, sending sonar down to look at the bottom. And then when we get a target that looks like a straight line, there's no straight lines in natural history. So if it's a straight line on the bottom, it might, it's a good indication it's a shipwreck. We'll go back and do another pass on it and see if we can get more detail on it and then put the robot down. And that's when they call me in to pull lines. So yeah, we'll keep looking, and we have at least, I think there's 50 more off of Whitefish Point, between Whitefish Point and Grand Island, that we're looking for. We would love to find the Bannockburn. We'd love to find the Western Reserve. The Western Reserve sister went down, the Gilcher. We'd love to find those vessels and find out what was the last story. One survivor from the Western Reserve, brand new ship, busted in half and went down. So there's a lot of secrets that are still down there that I can't wait. I mean, I think we will find them. Mm-hmm.
Is there a place in the Great Lakes where these huge monuments geometrically would never be natural?
And you're going to get me started on a whole nother tangent here. I'm going to write the 3 G's on the shipwrecks. You know what the 3 G's are? Ghosts, Griffin, and gold. And it's the only time we ever see Discovery Channel or History Channel come here. And Josh, I'm glad the guy has a TV show, but only comes here to bust our ghosts and do, I think that there's 3,000 amazing stories on the Great Lakes that don't involve ghosts, that don't involve gold. They're very interesting to me, and I would put those structures. It's interesting, yes, and the glaciers, when they pushed rocks, sometimes would line them up. We see a lot of investigations from the University of Michigan, where Guy Meadows is doing a lot of discoveries on finding these areas that they believe are where they would put rocks to make the big animals like elk run in a line and they could harvest them. I have yet to see any conclusive evidence that that's true. The Stonehenge that was real big, I think Mark Holly found it, and it was huge, and we still see it popping up on it. There's nothing to substantiate, and usually the picture they put on there isn't even the same picture. They said there was a picture of a bison or a buffalo or some kind of mastodon that was carved into a rock. I've never seen that either. So unfortunately, we get a lot of those stories, and people want to know about, is there a Great Lakes Triangle? No, I mean, how many ships have you heard disappear in the Bermuda Triangle since 1970? I mean, it seemed like that was the most deadly place to be in the entire ocean, and now we don't hear anything from there. And the Great Lakes have one from Lake Michigan that they say airplanes and stuff had vanished. There's more airplanes, off of where the air bases are. There's more airplanes where the aircraft carriers, lost them. Those are the interesting stories to me, not triangles and stuff. But if people will buy a book, I'll write the story. If you guys need a triangle book, the quadrangle, the deadly quadrangle is deadly.
Another question.
Yeah.
What year would the Salties have arrived in the Great Lakes here for?
We saw, I mean, as soon as we dug a canal around Niagara Falls, we started seeing saltwater vessels come in, but not until we did the Seaway. And that's, when we look at 1956, 57, the Fitzgerald was designed for a certain length that would fit through the Seaway system because that was a potential market. Fitzgerald never went into salt water, but by opening up that lock system, and has anybody gone through the Welland Canal before? It is so cool. I hate to brag, but I got to eat caviar on a cruise ship and go through the Welland Canal. It was so amazing to go through there, but we went through at night, and my poor wife had to hear me sneaking out of the cabin because I'd run out to try to get pictures whenever we could at the Soo Locks and the Welland Canal, because a lot of those things happen. But the Welland Canal opened it up to where we saw now saltwater traffic coming in very readily, and that's why we lost ships like Monrovia.
1900s, early 1900s?
Going at 1950s is when we got the bigger canal system that would allow for 700 footers. Oh, we had them, yeah, we had a canal system that came in much earlier than that, and we had a boat system that was designed, canalers, that were really designed just to take cargo from the upper Great Lakes, and then they'd offload it and put it onto these smaller canalers that could go into the river systems, especially into the channel as you go, into the ocean eventually, but anywhere up to the St. Lawrence. In the very back, yeah.
Do you know of any guided dives for shipwrecks?
Almost all of the charters would have somebody that would kind of guide. So there's all possibilities by calling your local dive shop and just saying, listen, I'm interested in seeing this. For my money, anything in northern Lake Huron, especially Tobermory, has really good visibility, so that's a great area to go. Again, I'd dive any place where there's water. If there's a mud puddle, I'll dive in it because I don't care. But for my money, those are the best where you'll see a lot more charters that come in. Milwaukee has a fantastic charter system. You can see the Prince Willem, the car ferry Milwaukee is over there, and those are kind of guided. You would get people that would help you along. The most dived shipwrecks are the Cedarville in the Straits of Mackinac. We've got a fully intact schooner that looks like a pirate ship called the Sandusky. They just found the William Young home. Remember when the William Young, when the car went over the Mackinac Bridge, the Leslie Pluar's Hugo, the state police went out to find the car and they found a brand new shipwreck and they dived that one. It's got a ship's wheel on it. It's gorgeous, but our good visibility that we have now also means that we have everything coated in zebra mussels. So where we used to be able to see a ship that the caulking in the seams and stuff, now it's a solid mass of zebra mussels. The winches are all covered. The wheels are all covered with these clams. And they're doing some damage, as we're starting to hear now as well. Yes, sir?
Anything about aircraft that went down?
Lots of aircraft. Wayne Lasardi out of the NOAA is doing incredible research. I've dove on 2 ships that the Tuskegee Airmen flew. Has anybody watched Masters of the Air? Watch Series 8. And it actually has a guy named Alexander Jefferson who's in my documentary Bombs Away. So 2 decades ago, I interviewed this Tuskegee Airman who was amongst the guys that actually crashed, and the guys who crashed in Lake Huron passed away. The design of the Aerocobra is that the engine's behind you, so if you hit the water, sadly the engine goes forward and you don't survive that. But there's at least 4 Tuskegee aircraft. I know of a balloon that's in my book called Bottled Goodbyes. balloon crashed in there. There's all kinds of biplanes that have gone down. B-52, which was collected in the 70s, and went down off of the power plant in Traverse City. There's tons of aircraft, sadly, that are down. A passenger airplane that just disappeared in the triangle, the deadly triangle. But sadly, they haven't found that one yet either, which I don't know that I'd look for that.
Lake Michigan?
Lake Michigan, yep, yep. But lots of aircraft. You've been a fantastic audience. Please support this incredible organization. Please stay for some cake, too. And I give you back to the Dons.